The 1st of November in Sudbury, Ontario is not a gentle month. It doesn't ease you into winter the way some places do. It just arrives, gray and certain, like a bill you already knew was coming. Heather Sinclair knew that feeling well. She was 38 years old, standing at the kitchen counter of her 2-bedroom apartment on Elm Street, trying to figure out if she could make one more dinner out of half a box of pasta and a can of diced tomatoes. The radiator in the hallway had been making that sound again, a low, metallic groan, like it was working twice as hard, for half the result, and the landlord had stopped returning her calls after the second message. Outside, the street lamps were already on at 4 in the afternoon, casting long orange lines across the snow that had been sitting on the sidewalk since Thursday, and didn't seem to be going anywhere. Her son Benji was 7 years old, and sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, or at least pretending to. He kept looking up at her with those big gray eyes the same color as his father's. And every time he did she smiled back, the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes, but is practiced enough that a 7-year-old can't tell the difference. His father, Ryan, had left 2 years ago. Not dramatically. No shouting, no thrown dishes, nothing Heather could point to afterward and say, that was the moment. He'd just slowly become someone who slept in the same bed but lived somewhere else entirely, until one morning he was gone, and a week later she got a letter from a lawyer in Toronto. The divorce was finalized 11 months after that. Ryan paid child support when he remembered to, which was roughly every other month. Heather had stopped counting on it. She worked at a medical equipment supplier on LaSalle Boulevard, processing orders and managing inventory. It wasn't the job she'd imagined for herself at 22. She'd been halfway through a nursing program at Laurentian when she got pregnant with Benji, and she'd told herself she'd go back, finish, that it was just a pause. It had been 7 years. The pause had become her life. She didn't let herself be bitter about it most days. Most days, the end of October had been brutal. The car needed new brake pads. $420 she hadn't planned for. Then Benji came home from school with a permission slip for a class trip to Science North, $45. And she'd signed it and handed over the money before she let herself look at the bank account, because she didn't want to see his face if she said no. The hydro bill had been higher than usual, and somewhere in all of that November arrived, and Heather found herself standing in her kitchen on a Friday evening, with $63 in her checking account, and 12 days until payday. $63. She'd already done the math 3 times on her phone calculator, the way you do when you're hoping the numbers will change. They don't. Rent was covered. She'd paid that on the 1st, scraped together from what was left of October's pay. But the fridge was getting sparse in the way that requires careful management, the kind where you start eating things in a specific order so nothing goes to waste, where you know exactly how many slices of bread are left without looking. Mom? Benji said from the table. Can we have hot chocolate tonight? She turned from the counter and looked at the back of the cupboard where the carnation tin had been sitting since September. Still a bit left. Yeah, buddy, we can do that. He went back to his worksheet with the easy satisfaction of a child whose small requests are still being met, and Heather turned back to the pasta water, willing it to boil. Saturday morning was errands. That was the plan, anyway. Walk to the Foodland on Paris Street, pick up what she needed for the week, keep it under $50, come home. She'd written the list out carefully the night before. No extras. Just the things that would stretch into actual meals. A bag of rice, dried lentils, a box of oats, milk, bread, eggs, 2 cans of soup, an apple or 2 if the price wasn't absurd. She'd checked the flyer online. Benji walked beside her, with his hands jammed in his jacket pockets, wearing the winter coat she'd bought him in September. Already a bit short in the arms, because he'd grown 2 inches since last winter, and apparently wasn't planning to stop. She'd been telling herself she'd find him a new one at the Value Village on Elm, but every time she meant to go something else came up. It smells like snow, he said. It's November in Sudbury. It always smells like snow. No. Like more snow. He looked up at the sky with complete authority the way kids do. Like tonight. She glanced up. He was probably right. The clouds had that low pale look. Inside the store it was warm and bright, and full of the particular Saturday morning energy of people who are doing their weekly shop without thinking too hard about it. Carts piled high, kids asking for cereal, couples debating whether to get the larger yogurt. Heather moved through it with her list and a handbasket, not a cart, because a basket is easier to keep honest. She found the oats, the eggs, the bread, the store brand, not the nice one with the seeds on top that Benji liked, the lentils, rice, milk, 2 apples, because they were on sale. In the soup aisle, she stood for a moment in front of the canned goods, running numbers in her head. She had 1 soup left, the tomato. If she got 2 more, that covered 3 dinners with something on the side. She put 2 cans of vegetable soup in the basket and kept moving. At the end of the aisle, near the baked goods, Benji stopped. There was a small display of day-old muffins near the bakery section. Reduced, the orange sticker said. A package of 6 blueberry muffins for $1.99. He looked at them. He didn't say anything. He just looked. Heather checked the basket in her hand. She did a quick number in her head. If the total came to around $48.49, she could do it. She picked them up and put them in the basket, and Benji's face did that thing. That quiet, contained light. The kind of happy that doesn't make noise because he'd already learned not to ask too loudly. That should have been the moment she felt okay, and she did for about 30 seconds. At the checkout, she put everything on the belt carefully, organized the way she always did, heaviest first, and waited. The cashier was a teenage girl moving at a reasonable pace, scanning each item without fanfare. Heather watched the number on the screen the way she always did. She'd gotten good at keeping a rough running total in her head. It was a skill she'd developed without meaning to. And when the last item went through, she was already reaching for her wallet. $54.80, the girl said. Heather stopped. She recalculated. $54.80. She had $63 total. After this, she'd have $8.20 to last 12 days. $8. She thought about gas, about Benji's lunch snacks, about the possibility, always the possibility, of something going wrong. She looked at the basket, looked at the belt. The muffins were sitting at the end, bright blue sticker visible. She picked them up. Actually, she said, I'll leave these. The cashier nodded and voided them off without expression. Benji was standing beside the cart area, looking at nothing in particular, and Heather had the specific experience of being grateful he hadn't seen. $49.60, the cashier said. Heather tapped her card, waited. The machine approved it, and something in her chest released slightly, and she started packing the bags. She was reaching for the last can when a voice came from behind her. Excuse me, I think you forgot these. She turned around. A man was standing just behind her in line, holding the package of blueberry muffins. He was maybe 45, early 50s at most, with that particular look of someone who has spent a lot of time outdoors, weathered in a calm way, not rough. He was wearing a heavy canvas work jacket, the kind that gets worn in for years, and he had a modest cart with maybe 10 items in it. I didn't forget them, Heather said, and her voice came out more measured than she felt. I put them back. The man looked at her for a moment. Not in a pitying way, more like he was just registering what she'd said. Then he looked at the boy standing a few feet away. Would you mind if I added them to my order? He said, and then gave them to you on the way out. It was an odd enough phrasing that Heather almost laughed. You don't have to do that. I know. He set the muffins on the belt with his groceries. I'd like to. There's a version of this where she says no again, and she almost did. Pride is a complicated thing when you're a single parent. It's not stubbornness. It's just that the moment you let someone see the full picture, you can't take it back. But there was something about the way he'd said it, I'd like to, that didn't have the shape of pity. It was matter of fact, like returning a dropped glove. She didn't say anything else. She finished packing her bags. Outside the store, the man found her by the entrance, where she'd stopped to put her toque back on and get Benji's hood up. Here you go. He handed over the muffins. Then he looked at the boy. What's your name, buddy? Benji? Good name. You like blueberry? Benji nodded with some conviction. Good call. He looked back at Heather. Have a good Saturday. And he walked to his truck, a older F-150, dark green, the kind with rust along the wheel wells, loaded his bags in the back and drove away. Heather stood on the sidewalk for a second, holding the muffins, the cold air sharp in her lungs. Mom, Benji said. Yeah, that was nice. It was. She took his hand and they started walking. It really was. She didn't think much more about it that day. They walked home. She put the groceries away with the specific satisfaction of a full fridge after a week of scraping. And in the afternoon, Benji watched cartoons while she sat at the kitchen table and worked out how to move money around to cover it before the due date. Sunday was quiet. Monday she went back to work. The week moved the way weeks do when you're keeping everything running on a tight margin. One day at a time. Not letting yourself think too far ahead, checking the account balance every morning with a kind of controlled dread, like reading a weather forecast for somewhere you can't leave. Wednesday she was back at the Foodland. She hadn't planned to be. She'd budgeted for one trip, Saturday. But Benji had come home from school with a runny nose and a request for chicken soup, real chicken soup, not from a can, and she'd been unable to say no to the specific look on his face. She'd checked. She had enough for a small package of bone-in chicken thighs and a couple of carrots if she was careful. She was in the meat section when she heard someone say her name. She turned around and it took her a beat to place him. The canvas jacket, the same quiet face. The man from Saturday. Heather, right? He looked mildly uncertain. I heard your son say it. Sorry if that's strange. No. She shifted the basket to her other hand. I remember you, Dennis Cadott, he said and offered his hand. She shook it. His handshake was firm without being performative. You shop here a lot? She asked, because she felt she should say something. Most weeks. I live about 3 blocks over on Pine. He nodded at her basket. Sick kid? Little bit of a cold. He wanted real soup. Dennis nodded like that made complete sense. Chicken thighs are better than breasts for broth. More collagen. That's what I figured. They stood in the aisle for a moment with the slightly awkward geometry of two people who don't quite know each other, and then he said, Can I ask you something? She waited. The other day. I don't want to embarrass you. He said it simply, no hedging. But I've been thinking about it. I know that look. She felt something tighten across her shoulders. What look? The look of someone who's doing the math out loud at the register. He wasn't unkind about it. My mother had that look for most of my childhood. I grew up in Capriole, 5 kids. My dad left when I was 9. He paused. I'm not saying that to make a point. I just want you to know I'm not looking down at you. Heather looked at him for a long moment. Thank you for the muffins, she said finally. He nodded. They were good? He ate 3 before we even got home. Dennis smiled, not a big smile but real. Good. They ended up walking to the checkout at the same time, with the loose coincidence of 2 people going in the same direction. He asked about the soup. How she made it, whether she added anything for flavor, and she found herself talking about her grandmother's recipe, the one with a handful of barley and a bay leaf, and by the time they were outside she'd told him more than she'd expected to. Well, he said, unlocking his truck. Good luck with the patient. She laughed, a real one. Thanks. She walked home with the chicken thighs and the carrots, and that night the apartment smelled like something warm and good for the first time in weeks, and Benji ate 2 full bowls, and fell asleep on the couch before 8 o'clock, and Heather sat in the quiet of the kitchen and felt, just for a moment, like things were okay. She didn't expect to see Dennis again, but Sudbury is a mid-sized city in the way that means you keep seeing the same people. The following Saturday, she was at the library with Benji. She took him most weekends, partly because he liked it, and partly because it was warm and free. And Dennis was there, returning a stack of books at the front desk. He raised a hand when he saw her. She raised one back. A week after that, she ran into him at the Tim Hortons on Elgin, where she'd stopped to get Benji a hot chocolate with the $1.25 she'd set aside for exactly that. Dennis was in line ahead of her, and when he got to the front, he ordered his coffee and then turned and said, And whatever they're having. Without making a production of it. You really don't have to keep doing that, Heather said. I know. He picked up his coffee. I'm going to sit down. You want to sit down? She did. They sat by the window for 45 minutes, and Dennis asked Benji about school, and Benji told him at length about a project he was doing on beavers for science class, and Dennis, it turned out, had worked for years with a land survey crew north of Sudbury, and had actually seen a beaver dam up close, and had a story about it that made Benji go completely still with attention. Heather watched her son's face and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. The particular relief of someone else, carrying a little of the weight of entertaining a 7-year-old. She learned more about Dennis over those 45 minutes. He was 51. He'd worked in mining survey and land assessment for 20 years, semi-retired now, took on contracts when they came up. He had 2 adult daughters, both in Sudbury. One was a dental hygienist, one was finishing a degree at Laurentian. He'd been divorced for 8 years. His ex-wife had moved to Hamilton, and they were, he said, on decent terms. He was, she thought, a straightforward person. Not dull. Just without pretense. The kind of person who says what they mean without requiring you to decode it. 3 weeks after the muffins, Heather came home from work on a Thursday to find a cardboard box sitting outside her apartment door. She almost walked past it, thinking it was Amazon for the neighbor down the hall, but her name was on it, written in block letters, with a Sharpie. Heather Sinclair, APT 4. She carried it inside and put it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a moment before opening it. Inside, a winter coat. Boys. Size 8 navy blue with a Sherpa lining and a hood. The tags were still on it. Underneath the coat, wrapped in a plastic bag, was a note written on a piece of paper torn from a notebook, the kind with the little red margin line. Saw one like this at the Bay, they had a sale. Didn't know his exact size so I guessed up a little, which seemed safer. No obligation attached to this. Dennis P.S. Also put in a couple of things in case useful. She looked back in the box. Under the coat were 2 items. a bag of the blueberry muffins and a Tim's gift card, with a small sticky note on it that said for hot chocolates. Heather sat down at the kitchen table. She hadn't cried in a long time. She'd gotten good at not, had trained herself out of it in the months after Ryan left. When she realized that crying in front of Benji made him frightened, and there was no one around to hold it for her anyway. She'd become efficient about grief and worry. Compartmentalized. But sitting at that kitchen table with a stranger's handwriting on a piece of lined paper, she cried. Quietly. So Benji wouldn't hear from the other room. Just for a minute. Not because she was sad. Because it had been a very long time since someone had simply paid attention. She texted the number he'd given her at Tim's. The coat fits. He's going to lose his mind when he gets home. Thank you. The response came a few minutes later. Good, that's all. She told herself not to make it into more than it was. Dennis was a kind person who had grown up understanding what a certain kind of hardship looked like, and he'd acted on that understanding. It didn't need to be a story, but Benji came home from school and tried on the coat and ran 3 laps around the kitchen, and then demanded to know who had sent it. And Heather said a friend, and Benji said what friend, and Heather said a nice man named Dennis. And Benji said, with complete 7-year-old, is he your boyfriend? No, Heather said firmly. You should make him your boyfriend, Benji said, and went back to his room. Heather stood in the kitchen and stared at nothing for a moment. She texted Dennis again. My son would like me to inform you that you should be my boyfriend. She paused, then added, I've told him that's not how it works. But I did want to say, would you want to come for dinner sometime as a thank you? Real chicken soup, barley, bay leaf and everything. The 3 dots appeared almost immediately. I would like that very much. Dennis came the following Saturday evening. He brought a loaf of sourdough from the bakery on Durham Street and a small tin of maple butter, because, he said, Benji had mentioned something about liking maple syrup and he'd overshot. Benji received the maple butter like a diplomatic gift, formally, and with great seriousness. The 3 of them sat around the small kitchen table in the apartment on Elm Street and the soup was good. Heather had spent longer on it than she had in years. Adding the barley, fishing out the chicken and shredding it properly, getting the carrots to the right softness. And the sourdough was good, and the conversation moved easily, the way it does when people are comfortable enough to let the silences sit. After dinner, while Benji was in his room, Dennis and Heather sat with tea and talked for 2 hours. About Sudbury, about their kids, about what it means to rebuild a life after it breaks apart. He said something she'd keep for a long time, that the hardest part of being divorced, for him, had been learning to ask for help, that men especially are taught to solve things alone, to have answers, and it had taken him years to understand that needing other people wasn't a failure. It was just being human. She told him about the nursing program, about pausing it, about the 7 years that had become her life. She hadn't said it out loud to anyone in a long time, that she still thought about it, that some nights she looked at the old textbooks on the shelf, and felt something that wasn't quite regret but lived it in the same neighborhood. Dennis listened the way some people do. Not waiting to respond, just actually listening. You're 38, he said, when she was done. Yeah, Laurentian has a part-time nursing stream. He said it without weight, just as a fact he happened to know. My daughter looked into it a couple years ago, before she switched to business. It takes longer but you'd still be working. Heather was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. Do you? He said it gently. She looked at her tea. It cost money. I'd need. It's not just tuition, it's books, placement hours, childcare, there are bursaries. He said it like he'd looked it up. She wondered if he had. There are grants for mature students, single parents specifically. Dennis, I'm just saying. He raised his hand slightly, a small surrender. You know your situation. I'm not trying to tell you what to do, she nodded. The kitchen was quiet. Outside a car passed on Elm Street, its headlight sweeping briefly across the window. I looked it up once, she said finally. About 2 years ago, I got as far as the application page and then closed the laptop. Why? She thought about it. Because wanting something you can't have is worse than not wanting it. Dennis considered that. Maybe, he said. But maybe you were closer than you thought. She thought about that conversation for weeks. In December, she started looking again. Not the application page, just the website, the program descriptions, the financial aid section. She made a list of the bursaries she might qualify for. She emailed the admissions office with 3 questions and got a response within 2 days. In January, she called Laurentian. In February, she submitted an application. She didn't tell Dennis right away. She was superstitious about it, the way you are when something matters too much. She told him in March when she got the letter. She was accepted, conditional on maintaining a certain GPA. with a financial aid package that covered most of the first year's tuition. She was starting in September. She called Dennis from the parking lot at work, sitting in her cold car, and when he answered she started talking before she'd figured out what to say. "I got in," she said. A beat of silence, then, "Of course you did." She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that sounds like crying almost. "I'm terrified." "Good." His voice was calm. "That means it's real." That summer was different. Not easier. Exactly. The money was still tight, the juggling was still constant. Benji still grew another inch and needed new shoes, and the car still had opinions about the cold. But something in the air had shifted. Heather walked through it differently. Like a person who has picked a direction. Dennis became a regular presence in their life in the quiet, unremarkable way that the right people do. Not dramatic, not sudden. Just there, he fixed the squeaking hinge on the apartment door without being asked, because it had bothered him. He drove Benji to hockey practice on Thursday evenings when Heather's shift ran late, and Benji, who had initially treated this with professional neutrality, began saving particular things to tell him. On a Sunday in August, the three of them drove up to Kivy Park and walked the trails until Benji's legs gave out somewhere around the 2-kilometer mark. And Heather and Dennis took turns carrying him on their backs for the last stretch back to the parking lot, and the three of them were laughing at something. She couldn't even remember what. Just that it had been something Benji said, something unself-conscious and perfectly timed. And in that moment, in the late afternoon light coming through the birch trees, she thought, this is what okay feels like. Not perfect. Not fixed. Just okay, which was enough. She started the nursing program in September, 2 weeks after Benji began grade 2. The first month was a shock. The volume of reading, the clinical placements, the relearning how to be a student at 38 when her brain had spent 7 years in logistics mode. She came home exhausted in a different way than she had from the warehouse job. The good exhausted. The kind that comes from using parts of yourself that had been waiting. She kept the job, part-time hours, juggling the schedule with clinical days and Benji's school calendar. With a spreadsheet she updated every Sunday night. Dennis helped where he could. Dinners dropped off, pickups covered. A patient and consistent presence. That never made her feel like she owed anything. She didn't take that for granted. Not for a single day. The November after she started the program, she was coming out of the Foodland on Paris Street on a Saturday morning. The same store, the same aisle, with Benji beside her, and she saw a woman standing at the checkout with a toddler on her hip, watching the number on the register climb with the specific stillness of someone doing arithmetic in their head. The woman put something back. A bag of grapes. Heather watched her pick up the rest of her bags, and she felt it, that exact weight, that particular arithmetic, the calculus of trying to stretch what isn't enough. She knew every part of it from the inside. She stepped forward before she'd decided to. Hey. Sorry. She touched the woman's arm gently. Can I grab those? She nodded at the grapes on the counter. The woman looked at her uncertain. I'd like to, Heather said, if that's okay. The woman's face did something complicated. She nodded, just slightly. Heather put the grapes back on the belt, paid for her own groceries, added the grapes. Handed them over. Have a good Saturday, she said. Outside, Benji looked up at her as they walked. He was wearing the navy coat. Still fit, barely, one more winter left in it. Mom, he said. That was the muffin thing. She looked at him. What? From 2 years ago, that man did that for us. The muffin thing. He looked up at her with a kind of clear-eyed certainty. You just did the muffin thing. Heather stopped walking for a moment. The November air was cold and specific. The way Sudbury air gets. Clean and direct and absolutely honest. The street was quiet. Somewhere behind her, through the store's glass doors, a cash register beeped. Yeah, she said. I guess I did. She took his hand. And they walked home through the gray-skied morning, and the world was not fixed or perfect or finished. It was still difficult and expensive and uncertain in all the ways that it had always been. But there are moments when the thread connecting who you were to who you're becoming is briefly visible. And you can see, just for a second, that it holds. That was one of those mornings.